Welcome back. So the topic of this lecture is the changing workplace. So this lecture ties in very well to our discussion of equal opportunity and diversity that we're actually going to have in class. But to understand why equal opportunity is important, you need to understand the trends that are impacting the workplace. So we've got kind of 6 different changes in the workplace, and we're going to talk about all those today. Okay, so we've got demographic. We've got technological. We've got structural. We've got competitive pressures. So let's maybe say competition. We've got reorganization of work. And kind of government intervention. So let's talk about demographic change first. And I just want to say as a caveat, people are always trying to project how these things are going to change. But any idea how they make these projections? They do it with kind of like a pseudo scenario building exercise, just like we did before. So these are just someone's projections. I'm not saying that these things are concrete, written in stone, or anything else. These are just projections. You are free to disagree with them. In fact, on many of these things, I happen to disagree, and I'll explain why as we go throughout this lecture. So demographic change. So population dynamics are something that occurs very slowly because you have to talk about generations of people changing. And it does alter labor forces. It seems, at least in the West, that labor force growth proportionally is slowing down. It seems that way. Ask me again in 10 years, I may have a different opinion. Some categories of workers demographically seem to be growing faster than others, but it's hard to say if this is something that'll continue. What seems to be happening, at least in the United States, is that Hispanic workers are increasing. So are the proportion of Asians in the workforce and African Americans, whereas Caucasians are decreasing, particularly among Caucasian males. That seems to be the trend. But it's hard to say if that's a trend that will continue. I will be right back. It's always very important to remember to put 25 cents in the electricity meter so you can wind it up before you do a lecture. Anyhow, technological change also has a huge impact on work. It changes the number of jobs available and also the types of jobs available. And we talked about this earlier during our discussion of deep historical forces. In the short run, technology is seen to reduce jobs, okay? Because it puts people out of work who are trained to do certain tasks that are no longer relevant due to technology. Now, in the long run, it seems that technology frees up people and then they wind up doing other and newer kinds of jobs. So if we think about the United States, you had an economy that was primarily agrarian, agricultural, and of course you had some light industry. Now, once farming became mechanized and the Industrial Revolution started taking off, then all of a sudden a person, hammering on, a piece of steel or a piece of iron to flatten it out, then that could be done with a machine. That person was out of work, so that person and possibly that person's family, if they were all in the same occupation, had to do something else. And it seems that this has contributed to the rise of the service industry. So there's new and different kinds of jobs. In theory, these new and different kinds of jobs are higher paying than those low-skilled jobs. This is what it seems like. So automation and industrialization do have a turbulent impact on employment in the short run. In the long run, it's supposed to contribute to overall prosperity. I'll give one example that in particular that comes to mind. When I was in university, I remember, some of you may know in the Carolinas, that used to be an area known for high quality of furniture that was made. And of course, many of these firms in North Carolina wound up shipping all those jobs overseas. So what happened in the short run? Suddenly you had all these people who were master carpenters, people who understood how to use fabrics and make dyes for fabrics, people who are experts in upholstering furniture. All those kinds of people who engage in kind of blue-collar, manual, yet skilled labor were out of a job. So, and some of these people had only a couple of years left in the workforce before they retired. Some of them had 15 or 20 years left in the workforce before they retired. What happened? Well, Google came to the Carolinas and they tried to hire some of these people. Well, many of these people weren't familiar with technology in general, so they weren't hired by Google. So they continue to be unemployed. So for some of those people, they wound up retiring as unemployed individuals. A couple of universities wound up expanding their campuses and hiring people from the local community. So in kind of the medium term, some of those people found replacement employment. So in the long run, now the Carolinas are starting to have more technology and university jobs than they did before. But again, that's not much consolation to those people that lost their jobs in the furniture industry. So again, how do you define short and long run? Is it a few years? Is it a generation? Is it even 100 years? This is a serious debate, especially when it comes to changes. But again, technology certainly does change the number and types of jobs available. Even when I was in the Army, typist used to be an occupation. Typist. Now, of course, it's assumed that everybody can use a computer and everybody can type, so those kinds of jobs no longer exist. Okay, moving on. Structural change. Structural change is caused by kind of job creation and job destruction that changes the mix of occupations available in a work economy. Again, what we've seen, and I attribute this in large part to technology. The U.S., which used to be an agricultural nation, shifted to an industrialized nation, then to more of a service economy, and now more into the technology economy. So that seems to be a trend that is going to continue. Some countries, though, may never wish to change. There are certain European countries where I've been. These are agricultural economies. They didn't really industrialize. They're not necessarily poor countries, but they just made a different choice over their evolution than we have. Other countries that I visited in Europe didn't really industrialize, but they specialize in tourism, and so service. They kind of skipped the industrialization stage and have kind of went from agriculture almost straight to tourism. So it's hard to predict structural changes, and of course, after the technology revolution comes to fruition, there may be something totally different that comes along that contributes to more structural change. Yeah, if I knew what it was going to be, I'd be one of the richest men alive. So competitive pressures. A lot of recent trends have also intensified competition for American companies. Again, we talked about this during globalization and multinationals. With new international competition, consumer demands have changed. People want more and different kinds of products, and they also expect more quality at a better price. Large industries being deregulated, so no longer being government controlled and able to charge any price they want and perhaps suffer some with quality. That's up for the market to decide. And of course, American workers, by global standards, are pretty expensive. So Again, remember we talked about transaction cost economics previously? Typically when you do some of these jobs overseas, the labor and the production may be quite a bit less than what you can get from an American worker who would have a higher wage. So just keep that in mind. So competitive pressures are certainly changing the workplace. Okay, now we're at reorganization of work. Again, with environmental changes, technological changes, competitive pressures, and everything else, work is becoming greatly reorganized. That whole dynamic of transaction cost economics, those calculations are changing. Think about transport costs falling. Think about firms becoming global value chains, again, looking at transaction cost economics, and sending the manufacturing to low-cost countries and then shipping them back to consumers. Now, of course, that could all change. Transport costs could, of course, rise, and then the production costs could actually increase, and therefore that would justify bringing jobs back home. It's hard to say what will happen, but again, keep in mind that under the production piece, transportation is certainly something that you should consider when evaluating transaction costs. And one of the things that I was always taught in high school was that you can ship manufacturing and industrial type goods overseas, but you couldn't ship service things. And my high school economics teacher always said, well, you think about it. Can Joe the plumber or Steve the barber, can you actually outsource those services to a foreign country? No, nobody's going to go halfway across the world to get a haircut to save a few bucks. However, with the advent of technology, lots of services are being conducted overseas. You hear, some of you may have seen Slumdog Millionaire. You think about those call centers in India. That's a service-based industry, and of course, it's cheaper to have that done overseas, even with the communication costs added, than it is to do those things in-house. So the transaction cost equation changes because of the labor and production costs have dropped significantly due to technology. Also, under reorganization of work, there's two important terms that I want to make sure that you're familiar with, and that's outsourcing and offshoring. Outsourcing and offshoring, what does that mean? Well, outsourcing basically means that, and if you look at it from a transaction cost economics perspective, you search for those goods or services within the market, within an outside supplier. Offshoring is the same thing as outsourcing, it just means you do it overseas or from a foreign supplier. So you could go to Canada and have it done, go to Mexico and have it done, or any of your favorite countries overseas and have it done. Offshoring is a subset of outsourcing. Okay, so now we're going to start talking about the government aspects of the changing workplace, but we're going to stop this video right here, and we'll continue that in the next video.